Hi everybody, we're back again this week, and we're going to finish up talking about Mr. Lee's questions. Next week again, we're going to be gathering again. It'll be June. We're going to get together and we're going to start the Teachings for Victory Volume 1. Everybody that's normally around the table, see you next week, hopefully Wednesday night. In the meantime, there's a lot of stuff I have to get to tonight, and I have to try and create some continuity from where we were last week. And I ended last week reading from the orally transmitted teachings to the record of the orally transmitted teachings to qualify to Mr. Lee a little more about what his questions, what the nature of his questions were really pertaining to. And the point that I had started out with last week was the idea of being able to get your head wrapped around this reality of that was then, this is now. Okay, and I appreciate all the questions, but when I give material for people to reference the answers, I would expect you to go do that, right? So, I mean, when I talk about the Gosho, the selection of time, that is a major thesis. That's not a letter, Gosho. That's like a doctrinal, let me lay down the marker of what my teaching is, Gosho, okay? And like I said, the full answer, the more difficult and technical answer, but the correct answer referencing the sutras, starts on page 541 of volume 1 of the writings of Nichiren Daishonin. Anybody wants to go look that up? It's the selection of time, page 541. It starts, the paragraph begins, it has now been more than 50 years since these teachings spread throughout the country. And then they ask for references. And the Daishonin backs all that up. So, once again, what Mr. Lee asked last week, or what Mr. Lee asked a month ago, and that we had started to discuss last week was, Mr. Lee kind of like said, how do we know that Nichiren, basing his focus on the Lotus Sutra because of Tiantai, okay, how do we know that they didn't miss something? And, you know, because they're Buddhas, dude. This is the point. Okay, why is the emphasis of faith the emphasis of faith? Is it because they want us to all be brainwashed or to be so willing to be led by already having accepted some concept that is not really our own? Why is faith an issue? Why is faith the basis of everything? From that 2.5-year-old thing that we did on YouTube, you know, I talk about faith, 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 faith. Everything I talk about is faith, 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 ultimately. So why is faith important?
It's a reflection of you.
Yeah, it's a reflection of you, obviously, because you won't be able to have faith that you haven't made the cause to manifest. Okay, but why is faith important?
It is the key.
Why is it the key?
Because it's the core. It is the core of these.
Why is it the core?
You don't have
What about it? What about it is that? What about it is its importance aspect? Is it the faith of deference? Is it the faith of an accommodation of something greater than you? No.
Because faith is wake up.
It's not only wake up. Faith is, again, how do you wake up? Faith is wake up.
realize.
Yeah, but how do you get to that point?
The real faith.
You have to listen to someone else that understands the teaching.
Yes.
Share the teaching with you
Yes.
correctly.
Yes.
The faith issue is about not doubting what they're allowing you to jump over as it relates to an expedient. So,
Right.
when we talk about somebody like, how do we know Tiantai didn't miss anything? Well, he only devoted his whole freaking life to investigating the subject. So this
Right.
wasn't something that was done casually, okay? And just like Nichiren, they didn't like just jump to the Lotus Sutra and go, oh, I think this one's cool. I like this one.
Right.
You know, it was from reading all the sutras and seeing what they all said, and they all ultimately, if you perceive the truth of the vast entirety of the teachings of Shakyamuni, you understood that it was all leading towards something, okay? And Shakyamuni then clarifies in his sutras what it is that he's leading to. And ultimately, he declares it with the greatest level of clarity in the Lotus and Nirvana Sutras. That's why they're referred to by Tiantai as the perfect teaching. Okay, these are the last teachings of his life, actually. So this is after he's been at this for a very long time. So Mr. Lee, we have to understand that any one of us could decide we're going to not listen to or believe in anything that we're told by another person. We want to see where it says that, and then we want to contemplate it, and then we want to come up with that conclusion. Go for it. You will not attain Buddhahood in your present form then, because you've had no faith in the teachings that Shakyamuni left. You've had no faith in the teachings that Nagarjuna, Vasubandhu, Nagarjuna, Tiantai, Myolo, Dengyo, and Nichiren left to expedite the process for you to be able to attain Buddhahood in your present form in a single lifetime. Okay? What other teaching did Shakyamuni leave behind that was possible? None. They were only theoretically. He reveals that he did it in numberless major world system dust particle kalpas in the past, but he doesn't say, how can that happen? He says it can happen. He says that all living beings are in fact already Buddhas. That's what he qualifies later. So what I'm trying to say is that you can keep asking me these same questions of, are you sure? How would they know? All that kind of stuff, dude. And it's all elementary. I mean, it's really elemental. Let me get to the most elemental point, okay? Who, like I said last week, who preached the Great Collection Sutra, which I'll read the definition of in a minute. It's Shakyamuni, okay? So Shakyamuni's teaching is the Great Collection Sutra, which says that in the 500-year period, it will become obscured and lost, and the Great Pure Law will be given rise and will be propagated for the 10,000 years of Mappo and beyond. But right here in the Threefold Lotus Sutra, okay? Now, why do we call this the Threefold Lotus Sutra? Because it includes two sutras, the opening and the closing, the Immeasurable Meaning Sutra and the Medicine King, I think it is, whatever the last one is. Pardon me. The meditation on Bodhisattva Universal Worthy. The Universal Worthy is the third of the Threefold Lotus Sutra. The first one is the Immeasurable Meaning Sutra. So, but they're considered the part of the Threefold Lotus Sutra because they all kind of run together. They all pertain to the same teaching. Okay, so the Immeasurable Meaning Sutra is sort of a introduction to what's going to be discussed in the Lotus Sutra. Okay, and the Universal Worthy Sutra is sort of like an epilogue to what has been revealed in the Lotus Sutra. But in the Immeasurable Meaning Sutra, in the words of Shakyamuni as they were recorded in these sutras and as they've been translated by the world-famed translator Burton Watson from the OTT, he contributed to this, as did the Gosho's, pardon me, this is by Burton Watson, the Lotus Sutra translation. So, what it says from the second chapter of the Immeasurable Meaning Sutra, here's the quote. He says, good men in the past, this is Shakyamuni talking, and again, the question is, how is it that this is also different now? What you're saying now is not like anything you've ever said before, which is your same question, Mr. Lee. The bodhisattvas that were at the assembly when the Lotus Sutra was preached had that same question you have, Mr. Lee. Why is this, what's going on? Okay? And so, Shakyamuni's reply to that question is that he's now revealing this truth because he has pity on the suffering of the beings of the 9 worlds. He says, thereupon the Buddha said to Bodhisattva Great Adornment, excellent, excellent, you great and good men. And why? Because they're inquiring about the truth. You have seen fit to ask the thus come one about the subtle and wonderful meaning of this profound, unsurpassed great vehicle. You should understand that by doing so, you can benefit many people, assure people and joy to human and heavenly beings, and rescue living beings from suffering. This is, in truth, great pity and compassion that you're expressing by even asking me to know and to want to understand. And because it is true, it cannot be vain. So this isn't about wanting to know stuff for the sake of your own embellishment or your own grandiosity. This is for the sake of making them equal to yourself. As a result of this, you will, because you're pursuing it for the right reason, as a result of this, you will without fail quickly attain unsurpassed enlightenment. And you will also make it possible for all living beings in the present age and in ages to come to attain unsurpassed enlightenment. Because as you attain Buddhahood, that's all you do from that point on, right? So, this is the most important thing for you to hear, Mr. Lee. He then says, good men, in the past, I sat upright for 6 years under the Bodhi tree in the place of enlightenment and was able to gain supreme perfect enlightenment. With the Buddha eye, I observed all phenomena and knew that this enlightenment could not be explained or described. Why? Because I knew that living beings are not alike in their natures and desires. I couldn't say to a multitude of people they wouldn't have the same seeking spirit, the same capacity, they would become confused. Why? Because I knew that living beings are not alike in their natures and desires. Do they want it to be puffed up and be smarter than everybody else, or is it truly for the sake of compassion, out of a sense of compassion? He says, and because their natures and desires are not alike, I preached the law in various different ways in these previous teachings till now, that I'm just now revealing. He says, preaching the law in various different ways, I made use of the power of expedient means. I didn't lie, but I didn't reveal the absolute source of the truth that I was speaking of. I spoke of its results. Right. He says, but in these more, and this is the important thing, because this is a quote that Daishonin refers to over and over and over again, and this is the quote that Tiantai read in the Lotus Sutra and said, whoa, this is saying something very deep here. He says, but in these more than 40 years, I have not yet revealed the truth. Therefore, the ways they gained were not uniform, but differed in different cases, and they have not been able to quickly attain unsurpassed enlightenment. And that's the point, Mr. Lee. This is the teaching that allows for us to quickly attain the Buddha way. If you want to go the slow route, you can go the slow route, but you're not going to get there in a single lifetime, and I can't guarantee where you're going to end up in your next lifetime. You're going to run into me again? Don't know. Okay? So that's why we're asked to have faith. Faith is the thing that allows us to make the leap to go, okay, I'm going to assume Tiantai knows more than I do. I'm going to assume that the Daishonin knows more than I do. I would assume that if either one of these guys were going to start mouthing off and writing treatises, they've read a whole lot of other stuff that would allow them to back up what they're saying. And if I was just going to take the time to read all their stuff, I'd be able to find that. And I have. I can't do that for you, sir. You have to do that for yourself. We all have to do that for ourselves. But that's the point. The point is that in the Immeasurable Meaning Sutras, Shakyamuni clearly states, in the more than 40 years that I've been preaching, I have not yet told you what the real deal is yet. Okay? So, then getting into where I'm headed with this, because we're ultimately headed towards the Expedient Means chapter of the orally transmitted teachings, and this is going to be quite extensive. I'm not going to be able to look at you're going to have to tell me what time it is. Okay, I just realized that. Okay, so I have to get a few things in here. First of all, let me read about the Great Collection Sutra, since this is the important point, because this jump off is the reality that the Great Collection Sutra talks about the 500-year periods. Okay, so you need to be very clear about why did Tiantai and Nichiren go in the direction that they did? Because they'd read everything, and it says right here in the Great Collection Sutra, which is part of the Wisdom Sutras, the Great Collection Sutra, a collection of sutras. This is on the dictionary on page 563. And if you look around a lot, you're going to confuse me. Everything's good? Okay. A collection of sutras translated into Chinese by Dharmaraksha. This is on page, my pronunciation may suck. You go look it up on page 263 yourself. Great Collection Sutra under G. These sutras were compiled into a single sutra, or the 60-volume Great Collection Sutra, by a Chinese priest named Sun Qiu in 586. Among the better-known selections are the 24th volume, which refers to the three calamities, and the 55th volume, which predicts in some detail how the spread of Buddhism will unfold, describing its rise, prosperity, and decline over the 500-year periods following Shakyamuni's death. It also discusses the significance of the latter day of the law, when Shakyamuni's teachings become obscured and lost. Its contents take the form of Shakyamuni Buddha preaching to a great assembly of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas who have gathered from the worlds of the 10 directions. See also 500-year periods. Let me see here. 500-year periods. Yeah, 500-year periods on page 184. 5 consecutive periods following Shakyamuni's death, during which Buddhism is said to spread, prosper, and eventually decline. These 500-year periods are described in the Great Collection Sutra and predict the course of Buddhism in the first 2,500 years following Shakyamuni's death. In chronological sequence, the 500-year periods are the age of attaining liberation, in which many people attain emancipation through practicing the Buddha's teachings. 2. The age of meditation, when meditation is widely practiced. The age of 3. The age of reading, reciting, and listening, in which the people study and recite the sutras and hear lectures on them as their central practice. 4. The age of building temples and stupas, when many temples and stupas are built, but the spirit of seeking the Buddha's teachings declines. And 5. The age of quarrels and disputes, also known as the age of conflict, when strife occurs among various rival schools and Shakyamuni's teachings become obscured and lost. In terms of the 3 periods, the age of attaining liberation and the age of meditation correspond to the former day of the law, and the age of reading, reciting, and listening to the age of building temples and stupas correspond to the middle day of the law, and the age of quarrels and disputes corresponds to the beginning of the latter day of the law. Regarding this 5th period, Shakyamuni says in the Great Collection Sutra, quarrels and disputes will arise among the adherents to my teachings, and the pure law will become obscured and lost. And that's when the great pure law is supposed to become manifest. And we believe that to be Nichiren Daishonin's Nam-myoho Renge-kyo. So, I'm going to be going into the orally transmitted teachings tonight. We have another friend, Laurent, that's asked a question about parable of medicinal herbs or something. I'm going to answer that next week. The key is that a few weeks ago I had mentioned that there's a secret way to kind of speed read the Lotus Sutra. And it's especially important if you're going to read the record of the orally transmitted teachings. If you think you're ready to strap this on, and by the way, if you're a beginner and you're just curious, I really wouldn't encourage you to go into this first, because first of all, you should know what the Lotus Sutra says before you start reading Nietzsche and reinterpreting it, so that you don't become confused with what the Lotus Sutra says versus what this says, and you understand the distinction. Also understand that there is a way to speed read. If you want to read a particular chapter of the orally transmitted teachings, you can give yourself the benefit of at least understanding a little bit about what that chapter is going to discuss by going to the Dictionary of Buddhism and looking that specific chapter up. So if you go to the Lotus Sutra of the Wonderful Law on page 371 under the letter L, and look it up, it'll give you chapter by chapter, chapter 1 through 28, what the title of that chapter is. You can then go back and look up that chapter. Expedient means, okay, which I know is chapter 2. I just looked up the Lotus Sutra of the Wonderful Law under L, and that tells me that the second chapter is the Expedient Means chapter. I go to E, and I find Expedient Means chapter. Okay, it's talking about the Lotus Sutra. Now let me read that before I read the orally transmitted teachings, point 1, point 2, point 3. Maybe get to 4. We'll see what happens. Expedient Means chapter, the second chapter of the Lotus Sutra, in which Shakyamuni Buddha reveals that the purpose of a Buddha's advent in the world is to lead all people to enlightenment. Shakyamuni shows that all people have the potential for Buddhahood, namely that Buddhahood is not separate from ordinary people, but is inherent in their lives. It is the principal chapter of the theoretical first half of the Lotus Sutra and one of two pivotal chapters of the entire sutra, the other being the lifespan 16th chapter, the core of the essential teaching, the latter half essential teaching, not the essential teaching of Nam-myoho Renge-kyo for the latter day, but the essential teaching of the Lotus Sutra of the Buddhism of sowing, or the Buddhism of harvest. Okay? At the beginning of the second chapter, Expedient Means, Shakyamuni arises from the deep meditation called the Samadhi of the Origin of Immeasurable Meanings, which is the Immeasurable Meanings Sutra. That's what he's been doing. And addresses Shariputra, declaring that the wisdom of the Buddhas is infinitely profound and immeasurable, far beyond the comprehension of voice hearers and cause awakened ones. Only Buddhas, he says, can realize the true aspect of all phenomena, which consists of appearance, nature, entity, power, influence, internal cause, relation, latent effect, manifest effect, and consistency from beginning to end. This revelation that all living beings of the 10 worlds are innately endowed with and can manifest the true aspect identified as the 10 factors of life establishes a theoretical basis for the subsequent assertion that all people have the potential to attain Buddhahood. Based on this passage, Chentai established the principle of 3,000 realms in a single moment of life. So Ichinen Sanzen comes from this understanding of the teaching of the Expedient Means chapter of Lotus Sutra, which is the theoretical Shakyamuni first 14 chapters, right? It's the second chapter. Shakyamuni then reveals that the Buddhas, so Shakyamuni qualifies right there, here in the Lotus Sutra. He's not the only Buddha by any stretch of the imagination. He talks about many multitudes of Buddhas. Shakyamuni then reveals that the Buddhas make their advent for one great reason, to enable all people to attain the same enlightenment as themselves. So if we are in fact Buddhas, the purpose for us to make our advent and express that Buddhahood is strictly only to show the teaching to others that will allow them to achieve exactly the same state as we have ourselves. It's not about ever being above anybody. It's, again, creating the grand equality of all things. So, he says again, Shakyamuni then reveals that the Buddhas make their advent for one great reason, to enable all people to attain the same enlightenment as themselves. According to the chapter, their purpose is to open the door of the Buddha wisdom to all living beings, Nam-myoho Renge-kyo, to show the Buddha wisdom to living beings, Nam-myoho Renge-kyo, to cause living beings to awaken to the Buddha wisdom, Nam-myoho Renge-kyo, and induce living beings to enter the path of the Buddha wisdom, Nam-myoho Renge-kyo, because this is all contained within Nam-myoho Renge-kyo. This is the latter day of the law. Shakyamuni goes on to state that the three vehicles, or the teachings for voice hearers, cause awakened ones, and bodhisattvas, are not ends in themselves. As the questions you're asking me, many of those objectives are meditations to understand just single concepts. They're not about attaining Buddhahood. That's not enlightenment, to understand a concept. He says, Shakyamuni goes on to state that the three vehicles, or the teachings for voice hearers, cause awakened ones, are bodhisattva and bodhisattvas.